Dr. Robert Malone, thank you for being here today.
Well, thanks you guys for having me on. I look forward to our chat.
As do we. So I wanted to start off with a quick story. The Salk Institute, that you know well, is obviously famous in San Diego and around the world, I'm sure. But my wife and I actually took our engagement photos there. You know where there's the water channel that lines up with I think
I
the
will
summer
never forget it.
solstice.
It's a classic of brutalist architecture.
True. Yes. Um, and it's a closed campus, as you know, so we had to sort of hang around outside and wait for something like a young Robert Malone, I picture, to let us in the gate so we could do the photos. But
with
our
with young Photog in tow. That must have been interesting.
that's right. um so that's my connection to the Salk Institute, is we have pictures hanging around our house of my wife and I engagement, which is a fun little connection.
I think it's a stunning piece of architecture. It is classically brutalist.
Hmm.
So it is the perfect home for authoritarian science, uh,
Right.
and um, and it has a huge number of stories behind it. The cliffs beyond that, you remember Black's Beach, of course, and hang gliding
Hmm.
and all of that notorious stuff that's right there. As you look to the ocean towards the right between the Salk and Scripps, and that little canyon that runs down from the Salk to the left of that road was supposed to house the postdocs. So they were going to build housing. That would have been a really nice place to hang.
Hmm.
Is That was supposed to be housing, but they ran out of money, and that never materialized. And they bought a facility, Salk Institute Biologic Associates, down the coast in La Jolla proper, uh, and that was set up before Torrey Pines Road exploded, and
Hmm.
Sorrento Valley. That ended up the real biotech hub that drives the new La Jolla and new San Diego. Another fun story about that was that, uh, so they say, when Jonas was recruited, the La Jolla realtors would not sell him a house because he was, wait for it, Jewish. And
Oh, wow.
there was a really strong anti Semitism trend. And the University of California basically had to step in and knock heads among the La Jolla community to get them to play nice with Jonas Salk and allow him to get his house, etc. Uh,
Oh, wow.
that's another fun fact. Sorry, people pestering me on the phone, so I had to look away.
Yeah, no
Lots and
problem.
lots of stories. The Salk is an amazing place. Jonas was a funny guy. He was kind of a notorious asshole. Really not very nice to the common person. Fairly arrogant and well known for it, and a little bit kind of angry, bitter. I think part of that might have been driven by the fact that he did not get a Nobel. And when I was there, I think there were 8 Nobel laureates. So he was surrounded by the creme de la creme in modern biology, but he didn't quite measure up. And there was even a pecking order within the Salk among Nobel laureates. There were those that were solo. There was Francis Crick, of course, who was a total gentleman. Uh, and fun fact with him, he had a Peugeot that he would drive, and the license plate was ATGC for anybody that understands what DNA is. And the Salk had basically scoured the world when it was stood up, and brought a lot of the top leaders in this growing new field of molecular biology and virology to the institute. So a number of Brits were brought in. It was really quite a hothouse, and I'm still uh, wondering uh, from my experiences there and my time and seeing the infrastructure. whether or not a significant part of that wasn't just March of Dimes money, but it was, let's say, military biodefense complex money behind a lot of that infrastructure. But a fascinating place, nevertheless, and a lot of good stuff came out of there.
So, what brought you there to the Salk Institute, and what were you working on?
So I had cut my teeth at UC Davis in lab bench research, working for a MD PhD pathologist that had come out of the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in DC, Bethesda, and who had just completed a fellowship as a full professor in the laboratory of Bishop and Varmus at UCSF, who had just won the Nobel Prize for the discovery of oncogenes. And so I was allowed into this laboratory as a young man, as a sophomore, basically, at UC Davis. And I became a total lab rat. And the laboratory was focused on breast cancer and a retrovirus model. We hear a lot about retroviruses these days, like HIV, a retrovirus model for breast cancer. And that's where I learned to work with RNA and DNA and southern blots and sequencing and all that kind of stuff. And then I wanted to go to medical school, but it was like you had to be a Florida egotist to think that you were actually going to make it because it was so wickedly competitive. And so I had to have a backup plan, and which was that I would be a bench scientist working in this kind of an area, and then exceeded expectations and managed to get an MD PhD scholarship at Northwestern. And then the question was, well, what is a guy with this background in retroviruses going to do as a physician scientist? And I really wanted to do gene therapy. And the leading people in gene therapy in really all the world were Ted Friedman, who'd come up with the idea, who was located in the Department of Pediatrics in the main hospital on campus at UC San Diego, and this character named Inder Verma, who had been trained in the laboratory of David Baltimore, a Nobel laureate, along with Howard Timmon, for discovering reverse transcriptase, which is what makes retroviruses work. And so my wife, as a basically native Santa Barbarian, was not very pleased with life in Chicago along the waterfront. And so after 2 years of that and a new baby, she wanted to get out of Dodge. And so I applied for a variety of alternate places to do my graduate work. And because I was so passionate about gene therapy, they let me in, and I had like pegged the needle on my GRE scores because I'd already had 2 years of medical school plus intense training in biochemistry and molecular biology at UC Davis. So I got in, and Ted Friedman, I talked to him. He was kind of my first choice. And he wanted out of gene therapy. He wanted nothing to do with retroviruses anymore. He was totally burned out. It was never going to work. He was the nattering nabob. And he offered me a different project. He said, well, there's this particular chromosome and that I'm interested in, and you could build what's called an ordered cosmid library, which is the starting point to sequencing the entire chromosome. And if I had said yes, I would have been at the very forefront of the Human Genome Project. But as often seems to be my trajectory, I had done enough sequencing. I thought it was insanely boring. I didn't want anything to do with that. I wanted to be a gene therapy jock. And so I went to the alternative guy, which was Inder Verma, who's quite notorious for being abusive and kind of a character, and ended up getting run out of the Salk based on Me Too allegations. He had a long history of sexual harassment claims. And so I convinced Inder to take me on, and that's how I landed there in the laboratory of molecular virology in a postdoc lab, which I was the only graduate student in an insanely competitive 16-person postdoc lab, which was not a recipe for great joy and satisfaction, I can tell you. But I I was guilty of perhaps having too high of an opinion of myself. It's funny how time will wear those things away to young men who may have started off thinking that they were going to run the table. And certainly I got subjected to the grindstone of modern science and ended up leaving the Salk um, with a nervous breakdown and a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah, it was pretty
this
intense.
is where so this is where you were doing the work that would become the mRNA technology, and you got those early patents
Yeah,
on it. Is
it
that
started
right?
in '87 when I was like 27 or 28. And the initial patent disclosures are from then, signed off by the postdoc that was next to me at the bench, signed and dated, all right and proper. And it's that's another 5-minute story about the patent application. Uh, in their the Salk interviewed me, the Salk lawyers, and said that I was the sole inventor. Inder blew a circuit. Then they put him on, and then I left, and because I just couldn't cope with the in politics of UC San Diego fighting the Salk over what everybody thought was going to be a big money breakthrough invention from this unknown undergraduate or graduate student. And then a patent was filed from the Salk, and then Inder was hired as a consultant to the company that I left. I brought all my reagents from the Salk to a little startup across the street called Vical, and they set me up as a skunk works. It hadn't been their business plan, but that's another story. And then they hired Inder, and then somehow mysteriously the patent from the Salk got dropped, and only the patents from Vical got prosecuted. So that's the behind me. I call this the Alex Berenson. I don't have the focus on it. The Alex Berenson wall behind me of patents
Wow.
on RNA delivery and cationic liposomes. But
Wow.
sorry, Alex. So that's another long story. But that's what happened was all those disclosures. I have the documents. I have the disclosures. I have a lot of the original data. Inder kept my lab book. And I have the disclosure documents in my lab book from Vical, which all precedes Carrico and Weissman by about a decade, for what it's worth. But it doesn't matter when you have the interests of a large pharmaceutical company and UPenn lobbying for the Nobel Prize. That's another story.
I'm curious, like, when did you
Have I
start
left you
identifying?
speechless?
When did you start identifying issues with the mRNA
As
technology?
a dissident scientist. Yeah, so I actually abandoned it in the 1990s. I had contracts. We actually produced a number of marketed ketonic lipids for the research market. They're sold by Promega, and a number of patents around those from work that I did when I returned to UC Davis and set up a gene therapy program. And I was working as a California Primate Research Center investigator, in addition to being in the Department of Pathology, reporting to that original mentor that I'd had years before. It was basically a safe landing place for me, as I was at that point a little bit bruised. And so I did, me and my laboratory and colleagues, and Jill also working in the lab, did a number of non-human primate experiments involving delivery to lung with various cationic lipid polynucleotide complexes. And what we saw was these things were insanely inflammatory, like nobody's business. And I couldn't overcome it. We developed many, many different cationic lipids, hundreds of different formulations, and tested some of them in animals, mice, and non-human primates, and always had this problem. And in fact, when Katie Carrico called me in the mid 90s, when she wanted to launch her work with RNA, I connected her with various people in the RNA world, and told her about the problem of the inflammation, which might have been what prompted her and Drew Weissman to investigate the use of pseudouridine, because it is immunosuppressive. But that's my story with this. Is I just didn't think that the cationic lipid, or we call them lipid nanoparticles in the lay press now, were going to really meet muster in terms of a human therapeutic or prophylactic formulation, because they were so toxic. And I moved on to other technologies like pulsed electrical fields and direct injection, and have work in that. And actually, my wife did the incorporation. Jill did the incorporation for the company Inovio, which is a pulsed electrical field company that worked on COVID vaccines also, and is based in La Jolla, California, Sereno Valley Road. So that's the story. Is I determined that this was a dead end, and that I couldn't overcome the toxicity, and likely no one else could either. There was huge investment from a Boston-based biotech in trying to develop these compounds for treating cystic fibrosis, so pulmonary delivery, and they abandoned it also because of the toxicity. So it was a surprise to me when I heard, I first knew that this was going to get kicked off when I heard about a DARPA program that was going to capitalize RNA vaccines specifically, and then that led to Moderna, and the two European startups, BioNTech and CureVac. CureVac was capitalized, by the way, by Mr. Elon Musk. So something that not many people are aware of. So that's the story of me becoming disenchanted with the tech.
As you share about that sort of disenchantment with tech, and as I think Henry mentioned earlier, we sort of came in contact with your work through COVID, and my experience of you originally was very much in this sort of very particular lane. I think in your Twitter bio, I think it's fair to say mRNA skeptic, right? So there was this sort of skeptic attached to this. But, it seems like now, and maybe this has always been the case because I've only known you for about 12 minutes now, but it seems like now you've sort of got this macro contrarian approach where there's a sort of skepticism around, as you sort of talk about censorship, as you talk about sort of the scientific industrial complex, if you will. And so I guess it's a two-part question. One is, could you share maybe a lightning rod moment where you sort of, if contrarian is a fair assessment, could you share a lightning rod moment throughout your history where you said, I'm a different sort of thinker, and you started to get that skepticism gene, if you will?
I've always been a free thinker. I'm a weird. They call them bent arrows in academe. I'm not a straight arrow. I'm a bent arrow. I was originally a physician. I'm sorry, originally a carpenter and a farmhand, working in avocado and lemon groves in Santa Barbara, and doing light construction, uh, decks and patios, and some very interesting work in Mission Canyon on a house that's called the Whale House. It's kind of notorious, uh, um, and we won't go down that road anymore. But this was in the 70s. I'm a child of the 70s, basically, growing up on the central coast of California. So Henry, as a San Diego uh, um, resident, probably has a sense of what I'm talking about. I grew up across from Haskell's Beach, which is a local surfing hangout. I'd ride my bike across 101 to get there. Uh, and my wife and I used to ride horses all along the coast, which was oil land back then. And if you're on a horse, they would let you ride there. And up into the hills when it was all cow trails before they put avocados in. And generally people would treat us okay and let us on their land because obviously we weren't hippies because we were on horseback. Uh, so I grew up, a rock climber, hung out in Yosemite a lot, did the Muir Trail, and I just don't come from the usual silver spoon kind of track that leads to physician scientist. Uh, so that's and my father-in-law, who became my mentor, was a genius who never graduated from high school. Played a key role in development of radar during World War II for the RAF. Was a RAF officer despite not graduating, and ended up running Raytheon Special Projects Division in Goleta, California, which, if you want to use the secret decoder ring, that is to say, the Raytheon CIA Skunk Works. So there was just a lot of that in Goleta at the time. The moon buggy was designed there at Delco, just as one other small factoid. So that's how I grew up, and uh, decided that I was going to get an education instead of being a carpenter bum and a rock climber. And so I really applied myself to it. I was, because I came into my education later, as often is the case with older students, I came in with a real commitment and a young wife and a need to make something of myself. She was working as a waitress, and I just busted my can and got straight A's to my great surprise. I was a computer science student at first, and then graduated, went to UC. I went from the Santa Barbara City College, bootstrapped basically, with some assistance from Jill's dad, and then went through this arc that you discuss, and then had this really rude awakening about the nature of big science. Up until that point, and up at the Salk, I had this very starry-eyed view of what big science was about and science in general. And I thought I was going to the Mecca of truth and wisdom and insight, and had a really hard lesson in reality. Uh, um, so that was one major pivot. Um, Set up a gene therapy lab at Davis after I finished my MD, and that was going great guns. But then politically, there was a shift in the leadership, and I kind of got left out in the cold and recruited to U Maryland, and that's another long story. Did a startup and then had my dean pull the carpet out from under me. I was being advocated that I would do startups and bring California startup culture into University of Maryland by the president of the University of Maryland, Baltimore. But the dean of the School of Medicine and the president of the university, unbeknownst to me, were at war with each other. And I was another one of the consequences, battlefield victims. And then about that time, I was taking training in bioethics because that was required as a physician and scientist that would do clinical research. And another famous gene therapist basically killed a kid named Jesse Gelsinger at UPenn. The guy's name is James Wilson. And I knew the insider details of what went down there. And there were a series of events. I got people in the press sought me out. Basically, my mentor said I had an obligation ethically to speak about what I knew had happened. And so I made a conscious decision knowing that it was probably going to destroy my career as a gene therapy guy, but it was ethically the right thing to do to speak out about what happened. And so if you look up the Cheryl Gay Stolberg series in the New York Times, for instance, I was a source for a lot of that and many others. And it did destroy my career. I never had another real gene therapy activity since then. And yet I was able to recover my career in part because I acted with integrity and I had a good friend network, colleague network. And that was another key point in which I realized that one could maintain one's integrity and one's ethics in the face of this situation we find ourselves in with modern biology and scientific research. So then come around, and I did basically, my mentor back at the Salk, Inder, had said that I will never get an NIH grant if he has anything to do with it because I left his laboratory. And in fact, I never did. So I was basically blackballed and knew it. And so that's part of why I ended up working quite a bit with the DoD is they were kind of get it done folks. They weren't part of that network. And so I kind of built a career of operating behind the scenes quietly, getting things done, both as a consultant and as a contractor for the government, and became really good at a lot of the core stuff that goes into actually making products, regulatory affairs, project management, contract development, etc. So it was really, truly a pretty deep insider and had been through, I think, 5 or 6 outbreaks in the past, kind of at the tip of the spear when COVID came around. And I got alerted about this novel coronavirus in Wuhan in the very beginning of January 2020. And got going. And then as time, I focused on drug repurposing. I did a threat assessment with the team and determined that producing a vaccine in a timely fashion that was going to be safe and effective was just not going to happen. And the best option was drug repurposing. So I was really the driver behind famotidine, also celecoxib, and then ivermectin to some extent. Then along comes Operation Warp Speed and this adenovirus and RNA vaccines, which are both gene therapy technology. The guy that the J&J tech for adenovirus was actually purchased when they bought the company called Crucell that had been built by the former senior postdoc at the Salk Institute under Inder Verma when I was there. Little fun fact. So I knew all this tech really well, and I saw what they were doing, and I was highly trained in bioethics and really objected to what was being done with not providing informed consent to patients and data manipulation, deletion of adverse event records, etc. And I thought that that was going to be a safe area. I knew how contentious all this was. I thought that was going to be a safe zone, that I could talk about the bioethics and say, no, this has got to be stopped because of this reason. And so I wrote one of the first, perhaps the first editorial in Trial Site News, it was, about the bioethics of all this and objecting to it. And then that set off a cascade. Steve Kirsch got me to do this broadcast with Brett Weinstein, Dark Horse podcast, How to Save the World in 4 Easy Steps, or I forget what the title was. And that before I did that broadcast, I hardly even heard of a podcast. And this name Dark Horse, I thought this had something to do with the dark web. So that's how naive I was. And then it got millions of views, and Brett got deplatformed or demonetized by YouTube because he talked about, wasn't about what we said about the jabs. It was what he said about ivermectin. That was his sin. And then suddenly this flood of people wanting to talk to me to just understand the tech. That gradually led to being more outspoken. And then the kind of the other key event was the corporate media just vilifying me, that just experiencing those waves and waves and waves of unjustified attacks, and the manipulation in Wikipedia of my bio, and vilification and defamation was like nothing I'd ever experienced. Of course, at the very beginning of 2020, my wife and I had put out a book called How to Prepare Yourself for the Novel Coronavirus, How to Prepare and Protect Yourself in the Novel Coronavirus. 100 pages, highly referenced, from a PhD and an MD. And it got deleted on its third edition by Amazon for, wait for it, failure to follow community standards, something that none of us had ever heard of before. And certainly we had followed, we met all the Amazon guidelines. There was no porn in it. We weren't defaming anybody. But the Amazon guys were all scratching their heads too. I don't know why it was deleted, but we were told that we had to, and there's no appeal, and there's nothing we can say about it. And there's nobody you can talk to about it, and go away. And that was kind of a oh shit, you're no longer in Kansas moment. So it was kind of in the COVID, the coming out, if we want to use that metaphor, from the closet of me being a behind the scenes consultant focused on getting stuff done and letting my clients take the credit, to an outspoken individual, was this kind of gradual gradient in experiencing this unfair character assassination and saying, what am I going to do about it? And so we made a conscious decision to throw ourselves into alternative media, which is why I sit here in a studio with a 3-camera rig and full lights and everything else, and did all these hundreds of podcasts. Somebody said to me once, and I should be paying you. You spend hours and hours and hours educating people. And that was kind of the mission. But then as I began to experience and start to make sense, I'm a guy who wants to understand why. I'm like that 3-year-old child that's constantly saying why. If you have kids, you know what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. The way things work. Why do we have this media ecosystem with this focus on defamation and character assassination, etc., and what's behind it? And that is really what led me down trying to make sense out of the propaganda The book, Lies My Government Told Me, was also a journey. Steve Kirsch telling me I needed to get on Substack was another door that opened. And then I was producing content on a daily basis and getting a lot of feedback. It exploded after Rogan. I got deplatformed from Twitter and LinkedIn, and then immediately Rogan, and then my Substack numbers just went exponential, as did the revenue. And suddenly I had a tiger by the tail and a whole new career, and I had to make sense out of that. And as time went by, Jill and I knew that the COVID crisis would end, but we destroyed our consulting business. And so what were we going to do for a living? And so Substack seemed to offer a good alternative and to become informed commentators. Again, basically still educating people, on what's going on. And I came to believe that the best weapon we have against the propaganda and the censorship industrial complex is to help people to understand what's going on, to teach them. And then as they get to understand the nature of propaganda, the structure of propaganda, they'll become more resistant to it. Perhaps that's a naive notion, but I think for at least 20 to 30% of the population, that's true. And there's various forks along the road, like meeting Matthias Desmet and the mass formation hypothesis and so many other things. And then the book, Lies My Government Told Me, which was a bestseller for a while. And then now we've taken our many Substack essays about propaganda and censorship and Psywar. And that's the new book that is reaching maturity now. It's in final editing stage. And once again, it's too long, too many words. I am an academic fundamentally, and I can't get away with it.
So, Robert, let me ask you this question here. So I so appreciate what you're sharing. And funny enough, I actually found your work through the Dark Horse podcast with you sitting alongside Steve Kirsch. So that was those were the early days.
I like to say 3 old men sitting around a table and it goes viral. And that's when I knew something was really weird.
Yeah. Yeah. And I appreciate what you're sort of saying. Truth be told, Henry and I went to business school together. So I love your sort of pivot to alternative media. Sort of embracing that opportunity, embracing, as you say, what happened to your career, looking for what's going to be next. I guess I would ask you, as that person that is asking why, why? I know at that sort of macro level, it's so complex. There's so many interconnections. But if you had to sort of share your macro treatise on the big why, like what is happening and why is it happening? Like, what do you think the sort of, and I know it's a big question and it's probably impossible to answer succinctly, but I really just am wondering, what's your sort of working hypothesis and what's your sort of working theory for the state of the world and where we find ourselves right now?
Klaus Schwab gave us this lovely little book called The Great Reset. So it's officially not a conspiracy theory. I should be wearing my exit or stop the WHO button right now. There's no question that, and anybody, I recommend James Lindsay if you want to get a better sense of the cultural stuff that's going on underneath all of this, having to do with wokeism and Marxism and these megatrends. There are very, very large economic interests, which in retrospect, Brett was able to perceive back on that Dark Horse podcast. Towards the end, you'll recall his rather naive appeal to Elon Musk to buy Pfizer. Often that's forgotten about. But he asked the same question back then. So this is 3 years ago now, that you're asking right now, which can be phrased as, who are the puppet masters? There's one way to think about it. And his explanation was that I spoke about this being an emergent phenomena that we were experiencing, having to do with the interaction of complex systems. And and actually have a Substack out that has a Venn diagram that illustrates this, which I immediately got ridiculed because Kamala Harris likes Venn diagrams. But so it is with the internet. But Brett pointed out, I think, a major insight, which is we're now living in a world in which there are these major transnational funds, and there's actually only a small number of them. Three of the key ones are BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. A Bank of America is in there, a number of others, and they all interlock, so they interown each other. So they're functionally really one corporation, one mega financial entity that does business as a peer with the People's Republic of China, for example. And Brett pointed out that all of these corporations are really owned by these very large entities. And we think of them as independent corporations, but they're really not. They function more like divisions of one corporation. And what we're really encountering, as Jeffrey Tucker so eloquently put the other day in the Epoch Times, Jeffrey being the person behind the Brownstone Institute, is the transformation of American capitalism into American corporatism, and now globalized corporatism. And these entities, Larry Fink being a kind of a stalking horse, as one example, these entities operate in an environment in which, as capital investment funds, they are decoupled from nation state. You remember in classical Marxist theory and a lot of the economic theory of mid-century and before, capital generally stayed coupled to its nation state of origin. And, amassed, we could use a Marxist explanation about the surplus value of labor, blah, blah, blah. But these blocks of capital tended to be grounded in relationships with nation states. And as was predicted in the 70s, I remember reading as a political science student, we had the rise of transnationalism. And this capital became decoupled from nation state and searches the world for return on investment. And it's very agnostic. It'll go where it gets that best ROI. And a case can be made that that's the way it should be under a capitalistic system. And probably Javier Milei would make that case as an anarcho-capitalist. But they are no longer coupled to nation states, and in many ways they're more powerful than nation states. Increasingly with the U.S. case can be made that the U.S. doesn't control BlackRock. BlackRock controls the U.S. government. So you have, one of the things that got me kicked off of, there was two things that got me kicked off of LinkedIn and probably Twitter. And one of them was pointing out that the chairman of Reuters also sits on the board of Pfizer. And it was an intrinsic conflict of interest. And this is just one example of the interlocking ownership relationships that exist that make all of these separate entities of press, pharma, and all other industries really functioning in lockstep in a coordinated fashion is because they all share common ownership. And BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard all say, oh, well, we don't, we're passive investors. We really don't direct the boards. That bullshit. And DEI and ESG are notable examples to prove the point. So that, and then they created their own trade union, as I like to say. And I used to catch flack for talking about this one also from the likes of Steve Bannon, who would tell me to stay in my lane, the World Economic Forum. And of course, the Atlantic Council and Bilderbergs and all these organizations, but particularly the WEF. created by the CIA with a heavy hand from Mr. Kissinger, former Mr. Kissinger, who was the mentor of Klaus Schwab, and basically put him in place as the leader at the WEF. The WEF, to my analysis, is a trade union of the 1,000 largest corporations in the world, and of those as a core of 100 largest corporations. And they sit about and prognosticate about the nature of the world and how the world should be in the future. A lot of people think about the WEF as a bunch of rich guys flying their jets into Davos in the winter to hang out with high-priced whores and go skiing and drink good wine, all of which is true, but and well documented in the press. But they forget that the WEF also holds its summer meetings in China, rotating between two cities. The WEF is deeply integrated into the CCP and vice versa. And a case can be made that the WEF and those large transnationals really like the CCP a lot. I think that a turning point was the Olympics, Beijing Olympics. These large corporations really like having a very large market with one set of rules. And they find totalitarianism kind of tasty. And I argue that from a standpoint of a transnational, a super mega transnational, one of your biggest business problems is friction. The friction associated with transactions in a wide variety of nation states with their own regulatory affairs, their own politics, etc. And so each of these independent nation states are associated with a cost burden of compliance and import restrictions and all that kind of stuff. And they would like to see that go away. They really would like to have a one world government. And I think one of the reasons they would like that is they would like everything harmonized because it would make business transactions better, smoother, more predictable. And they like the idea of a centralized command economy. Now, how many times do we have to learn the lesson that large command economies fail? Okay, they just don't. They are anti-innovation. They are incredibly inefficient. They're unable to respond efficiently to changes in various business parameters and environmental parameters, stressors. Somehow we still think that Marxism will work. It's just that it's never been properly tried, and utilitarianism, etc. And so if we can only get it right by gathering more data on everybody and applying artificial intelligence to get better predictive algorithms, then it would work. And so round and around we go on the merry-go-round, and that seems to be something that the likes of Larry Fink find very tasty. And they'd like that very much. And the WEF is a great, the WEF styles itself as the new global governance structure. And in many ways, the WEF, remember, again, WEF is created by CIA, as was the European Union. The WEF is really the European Union on steroids. If you want to understand their vision of the global harmonized government that they want to have, take some time to talk to dissidents from the European Union like Christine Anderson and say, well, how does the EU actually work functionally? Okay. And what you're going to find is that at the top, it is anti-democratic. It is absolutely not representative. It is an autocracy, a totalitarian autocracy. And they like it that way. And that is what the United States likes, by the way. There's the reference to Europe as the garden. We've created that structure, and it operates the way the United States government wants it to operate, or has up until recently. And now there's cracks forming, particularly with AfD in Germany. I mentioned Christine Anderson, and across much of Europe. The farmer protests, etc. So, and of course, the rise of BRICS, the alternative to the petrodollar. So I think
Mhm.
what's going on is these 1,000 largest companies with a core of 100 largest companies, which, by the way, include the companies that own all of the academic press. So that's no surprise that the academic press all acts in harmony with these various initiatives, and that's well documented. And we've written substacks about it and cited the literature, etc. But they sit around and prognosticate about what the future looks like. And strangely, it seems that they keep landing on versions of the future which are in their economic interests, which have aspects which they can exploit. So let's pick one stalking horse. Let's call it climate change. So, what's the response to climate change? We have to go green. Okay, so now the World Bank won't loan to African countries for
Mhm.
energy projects that don't involve windmills, basically windmills and solar. Now, it just so happens that those African countries, many of whom are sitting on enormous natural gas resources. And if those natural gas resources, if the World Bank would be allowed to capitalize the necessary power plants that would run on natural gas, it would transform Africa. Because what you guys, you said that you got a background in finance, and you're probably Bitcoiners surreptitiously, but you know that the only currency that really matters is energy, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And energy will free you or it will constrain you. And um, case can be made if you look at the Kissinger report that the United States government actively does not want to see Africa rise. They want to retain Africa as does China of the Belt and Road Initiative,
Mhm.
as a basic, and Latin America, as a mineral resource breadbasket that can be extracted. And they certainly don't want a strong, empowered a native populace to compete with them for access to a mineral, petroleum, and other resources. So that's where the WEF is coming from, is representing the interests of these very large companies. As I say, they function like a trade union in a strange way. Or since Dune is hot, maybe they're the Spacer Guild, or if not, and we're the Empire, I guess. But that's all in transition right now because of BRICS, etc. So that's how I see the world, and it's a strange situation. Um, so I find myself, you can't be in the biodefense business as I've been for a few decades without having a lot of socket with people in the intelligence community. I'm not
Mhm.
CIA. I've never been CIA. I've never worked for DARPA. Blah 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 blah. But although there's thousands of people in the world that believe I am, and you can't tell them differently. But these folks do come and talk to me, particularly people within Feds for Medical Freedom and the intelligence community dissidents. And um, uh, uh, the CIA has, if you look under the covers, almost every single major event in the COVID crisis has CIA fingerprints all over it. And so I came to the conclusion, and I kind of inadvertently spilled the beans on Bannon, I don't know, a few months ago, that a lot of this is coordinated and managed by the U.S. intelligence community, particularly the CIA, and from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the engineer of the virus, all the way through the cover-ups, the psyops, manipulation, etc. So that's one major force is corporatism, and they as they sit around and imagine the future. Of course, they are very enamored of transhumanism, and so they envision this dark transhuman vision in which human beings will basically become obsolete unless they are going to accept the appliances, sockets, and junctions that allow them to jack in, I think is the William Gibson term, uh, um, referring to the great author, cyberpunk author, uh, into the web, into this burgeoning awareness, machine awareness that is supposed to overtake human intelligence on some timeline. Some people say within a year, some people say within 10, and there's a range of opinions between that. And the likes of Mr. Gates thinks apparently that he can upload his consciousness to the web and live forever. Isn't that a future we would all like to see? So that's there. They are all wrapped up in Yuval Harari's bizarre, mad um, comments, and the it's very similar to the logic that drives the gain of function research community. Within this AI, machine learning, computational science world of well, we're so smart, we have the right to do this, and you don't know what's going on, and so you don't have the right to impose any restrictions on us or regulations. We're entitled to do this, and because we can see the future and you can't, and that seems to have won the field in the same way that green energy benefits those that manufacture solar panels and these wind farms that make no economic sense uh, and decimate bird populations, etc. But that's how I see things. Is we are caught in the nexus in a tornado, in a hurricane of kind of fantasy thinking on the part of very, very large economic interests. And the likes of Henry, Brandon, and Robert are uh, um, dust in the wind. Uh, um, we're irrelevant in a world that's dominated by these massive economic interests, and they will have their way with us, and they're entitled to do so. Because basically the golden rule, right? Those with the gold make the rules. And our only option is to try to understand what's going on, make sense of it, resist it where we can, and prepare, hope for the best and plan for the worst. And hence the rise of the logic that there is evil in the world. I wouldn't have ever said that a decade ago. I wouldn't have said that 4 years ago. I wouldn't have spoken about the devil as a force. But I find it very difficult to discuss modern trends in terms of political and economic policies without using traditional theologic language. It seems to be the only language that we have that can adequately describe what we're experiencing. And then that once you use language, language influences thought. We, as human beings, we basically use language as one of our primary ways to think. The other one is that what we call subconscious. But we use words a lot to describe our world, and then those very words craft how we conceive of that world. And so once we start reaching to theologic language, then we start framing what we're experiencing within that metaphor. And we start seeing, as James Lindsay does, I was referring to earlier, that we have this massive collapse of Western ethical norms, let's say. We call it, Judeo-Christian Judeo-Christian ethical belief structure or morality, etc. And clearly, these folks that live in a world in which they believe transhumanism is right around the corner and the human species is obsolete, uh, um, they don't buy into that world. That's not part of their frame of reference usually. And so we're lining up this big conflict, and now and the bicoastal elites that run the press and corporate media are all in on uh, basically pandering, I think, to these elites and these large economic interests, and so they do what they can to defend that frame of reference, and the rest of us are left on little podcasts. But I think this is I'm going on a rip here. I'm sorry, I'm dominating the conversation, but I'm not sorry. Uh, so so uh, um, I think, and this is triggered in part by the ugliness that's going on between Substack and Stripe at the moment, which is a hot topic for me. Uh,
Mhm.
um, with this creeping Stripe-based censorship based on demonetization. Uh, uh, I think that the true threat to the state, the reason why I'm treated as an enemy of the state, and that I don't think that's an overstatement, and many others are. We're labeled as domestic terrorists in various ways because we spread dis, or malinformation, and that's a fascinating set of definitions. Basically, misinformation is anything different from what the official narrative is that's promoted by the state or the WHO or the CDC, which is the state. Um, uh, Disinformation is spreading malinformation for political purposes and um, or falsehoods for political purposes. And then malinformation is anything that's it can be information that's true, but it causes people to distrust the state. So you can say true stuff that causes people to distrust the state, like writing a book called "The Lies My Government Told Me," and you're spreading malinformation even though it happens to be true. Those are all defined by the Department of Homeland Security as domestic terrorism now. So that's the world we're in,
Mhm.
and I think that underneath that, underneath Obama's famous speech at the Hoover Institute, that we have to have censorship in order to preserve democracy. What they're really saying is the rise of citizen journalism is a major threat to the um, uh, to the state and particularly the administrative state. And it must be countered, and it can't be countered using the old tools of basically co-opting editors and high-profile journalists. That is Operation Mockingbird and all of its derivatives. You know, the CIA directly, and by the way, the Church Commission pulled its punches. It knew darn well that the CIA had its tentacles into academia quite deeply. But um, back in the old days, when we all believed in CNN and the Washington Post, the New York Times, the newspaper of record, and etc., uh, as the arbiters of truth, that could be easily manipulated by the large interests such as the intelligence community in corporate America and global corporatism. But in a world of decentralized citizen journalists, uh, now they got a problem
Mhm.
because the only way, because it's decentralized, it's so widespread, the only option is an algorithmic based approach, which intrinsically is heavy handed, arbitrary, and
Mhm.
capricious. And that I think that the future, to try to have a silver lining note here with all this grim talk is that if we can somehow find a way to circumvent the censorship industrial complex, and it probably is going to require something like a Substack 2.0. Substack now is compromised, as are all the other platforms. Somehow, we've got to create a tool that is specifically designed to serve and enable the citizen journalist and aggregate and distribute their work product. And that, I think, will, if you've ever dealt with investment community, you know darn well they are gaga over, quote, disruptive technologies. I think the citizen journalist is the most disruptive technology in the information space that has arisen since the bloody printing press. And somehow we have to come up with a way to empower and serve and support the citizen journalist if we want to get to change that will allow us to resist this overbearing, heavy-handed, centralized command economy approach that we call corporatism to make it sound nice, or we call it public-private partnership to make it even sound nicer, but which was defined by Benito Mussolini, who would know and was qualified as fascism. That's what we have now is techno-fascism, and we need to stop, pussyfooting around about it, in my opinion.
Robert, do you have time for one more question? I'm dying to ask you something.
I've been so loquacious, I have to give you at least one more.
Okay. You said the word, so I have to ask you. Bitcoin. What is your take on Bitcoin?
So I had the privilege of hanging out quite a bit with Brock Pierce and various Bitcoin whales over the last 3 years in a bizarre set of circumstances, including spending time in Puerto Rico and Miami and being at the Bitcoin conferences. So that's where I come from. I don't hold Bitcoin. I'm not providing financial advice, but me personally, I hold precious metals. I like to have something tangible that I know that I can go down and buy grain for the horses with if I have to, assuming there's any grain to be had or any gasoline or diesel to be bought. But that's just me. I have had the benefit of having been tutored by folks like Brock about the underlying logic. Which I find quite compelling. I think in a world in which we migrate to something like decentralized pods, we call them intentional communities, embedded in a matrix of a hostile, centralized political economy, and this kind of decentralized matrix of intentional communities or pods being the only viable option for those who are just not able to comply for whatever reason. David Martin is a big fan of this also, and his thinking is much more advanced than mine is in terms of the economic tools. We have to have step back. I used to breed draft horses. And one of the things about breeding draft horses is it brings you into the Amish and Mennonite community. So I had the benefit of, I'm English, so I'm not really on the inside, English being anybody that's non-Amish, and is generally preyed upon by the Amish community economically. But I got to see those communities working. As you know, they tend to max out at about 20 families, and they split intentionally and create new satellite structures. That's because of the problems with scale in terms of management in a decentralized environment like they operate in, using barter largely. So if we're going to grow beyond a barter-based system, we have to have a exchange medium. And cyber currency, whether or not it's built around blockchain, so that one has a token which has a mutually agreed upon representation of value,
Mm-hmm.
is absolutely necessary. Uh, and um, and in a world in which we still have a functional digital infrastructure, I said that intentionally because we shouldn't accept that as a given, that we're going to continue to have that digital infrastructure that's necessary largely in order to use a blockchain based token as a
Mm-hmm.
medium of exchange. And then if that goes down, then God only, then we're back to precious metals. But Bitcoin and the other Ethereum, et cetera, have merit, um, and and we'll see. Are they? There's a whole, and I think this is part of the psyops, the whole logic that, well, really, those are all intentionally created by those large financial interests because they're going to be a tool for co-opting all of us and herding us into CBDC. And what's going to happen? I have some colleague who used to be really close to Brock as an advisor who was completely convinced that the whole Bitcoin community was fooling itself, and that the feds and the central banks were going to just step in at some point and make these cyber currency tools that are decentralized illegal. And if you hold them, they're going to hunt you down and January 6 you, and you're going to be forced into a position where you have to convert to their CBDC anyhow. And then you will be locked into digital chains for the rest of your natural life. So I can't see, there's so many different versions, and so much of this is wrapped up in propaganda and psyops that it's really hard to discern truth. So that's how I see that world and that community. Very complex, a lot of very powerful thinking,
Mm-hmm.
a clear unmet need, and an attempt to address it, and a tendency to smoke your own junk, to believe your own story maybe a little bit too much,
Mm-hmm.
and not, a lot of folks in the cybercurrency world have made big money and are young. I mean, the number of 20 something whales is kind of mind blowing. But these are folks that haven't generally had the benefit of the school of hard knocks for a couple of decades, and have a tendency to be a little starry-eyed in my assessment. So we'll see. Maybe it's only the starry-eyed true believers that can transform the world. That's one version of that story. Another one is old age and wickedness prevails over youth and enthusiasm every single time. So never underestimate the heavy hand of the Atlantic Council and central banks and the Bilderbergers And we could start naming names, many of whom have Jewish connotations, and so we shouldn't talk about them on public airwaves. But you get the point. We can go way down that rabbit hole in terms of who the masters of the universe are right now, and how this all plays out. But you cannot dispute that the COVID crisis is associated with the largest upward transfer of wealth in the history of modern world, and that whether or not it was intentional or it's as Ernst Wolff has nicely summarized in his thesis for all this, that it wasn't that the money exploited COVID, it's that the money created COVID. And it was intentional. That's one version of that story. Whether, cause and effect are hard to sort out. I like to say it's almost impossible to discern, to differentiate between incompetence and nefarious intent. And we have a good dollop of both going on. But I definitely think we have some nefarious intent. So there's my blather about cybercurrency.
That was good. I liked it. Well, Robert, we're grateful for you taking the time with us today. There could easily be a part 2, so maybe I'll follow up with you.
Well, this has been a
down
fun
the line
chat.
for that.
I've talked
This
too
has
much.
been great.
I haven't listened enough. So we should have a part 2 where you guys talk more and I listen more.
Well, that would be fun. Where should we send people in the show notes if they want to learn more from you?
So thanks for asking. The social media is Gab, Getter, Truth Social, X, at RW Malone MD. That makes it simple. There is the Malone Institute.org. And there is rwmalonemd.substack.com, at least for the near future. But I have started a legal action because of Stripe's insistence. I don't know if you're up on this. I just put this out as a Substack. It's just happened to a small number of people so far. We seem to be the pilot group. Stripe is insisting that we allow them full access to our bank account records, including historic records. So this is everything, not just Stripe-related transactions, which, I suspect that you two are of the ilk that you would rather not have a corporation, and by extension, the U.S. government, and whoever that corporation might want to sell the data to build their own AI or whatever the tool is going to be. You would rather not have the likes of Stripe, a $1 trillion annual transaction company, with full access to all your books. And I think that's arbitrary and capricious, and it is tortious business interference, and we're going to fight it. I put out an essay about this yesterday on Substack, again, rwmalonemd.substack.com, which includes a Give, Send, Go link, because my First Amendment attorney, Mark Muser of Dillon Law Group, tells me I should anticipate at least 100,000 to prosecute this case. So anything, any contributions are appreciated under the logic that basically the Bonhoeffer logic. First, they came from the Jews, and then in the end, they came from me, and there was no one left to fight for me. So we're taking this on early, knowing that probably this is the camel's nose towards social credit. And they're just kind of doing a pilot program with the likes of domestic terrorists like myself.
We will send people to Substack for now. I'll keep up with the news, and I'll remove that link if something changes. But again, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Robert.
Enjoy, both of you. Enjoy life.